Good evening and welcome. We've got a great presentation for you tonight by a combat veteran, Eric Donoho. A couple things I just wanted to share with you quick before I turn the mic over here to the president of our student veteran group, Bree Forsberg. I'm going to just share a couple things with you quick. Number one is the University of Dubuque and the partners that put this together, Weber Concrete, Prudential, the Veterans Freedom Center, and I'm missing somebody. Holiday Inn Express has done a great job of helping get this together. The way that the genesis of this is, Eric went and spoke at a Prudential employee event and impressed them so much that Donna approached me about having a venue here at the University of Dubuque to get Eric's message out to a larger community. So we've been working on this about since November, I think, and we got it to come together here. So I wanted to thank all those partners that brought this together, and also wanted to share with you that the University of Dubuque has always been a big supporter of the veteran community, and we have a great student veteran center here, and the Sergeant Jeff Dodge Veteran Center is the main supporter here for the partnership with the University of Dubuque. So again, thanks a lot for coming. I'm going to turn it over now to Bree, and she's going to do a few introductions and thank yous also, and then and we're going to be doing the national anthem, and then Eric will take over. Thanks a lot.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University of Dubuque President Jeffrey Bullock, welcome to the Heritage Center in John and Alice Butler Hall. I am Brenna Forsberg, President of the University of Dubuque Student Veterans Organization. I want to thank you all for coming out to this event in support of veterans. The University of Dubuque is a proud supporter of veterans and their families. Today we will have Samantha Otto perform the national anthem. Any military veterans among us may render the military salute during the singing of the national anthem. All others, please place your hand over your right hand over your heart. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are able, please stand.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watch were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Thank you, Samantha Otto, for your moving performance. At this time, if you are a Vietnam veteran and are able, please stand. We would like to personally thank you for your service and welcome home. The University of Dubuque is a proud Vietnam War commemorative partner. Thank you. At this time, would all other veterans and current serving military personnel please stand? Thank you all. Please be seated. We would also like to thank the Wendt Scholarship scholars for being here as well tonight. And now I'd like to tell you a little bit about our presenter, Eric Donoho. Eric Donoho is a decorated Army veteran, philanthropist, photographer, and public speaker. He was medically retired in 2009 for traumatic brain injury, migraines, and post-traumatic stress due to injuries sustained from 2 IEDs and 1 EFP during his 14-month deployment. Eric's story of recovery was the February 2017 cover for the Veterans of Foreign Wars magazine. Through his involvement in volunteer work with No Barriers, he credits the community to providing him positive friendships, inspiration, mentoring, and encouragement to keep climbing on his own life. He has traveled through the country sharing his story while trying to make a positive impact in other veterans' lives. Eric has a passion for photography and makes it available to individuals and corporations. He has been honored with having his photography shown in the National Exhibit of Veteran Art in Aspen, Colorado during Art Week. He lives in Indiana with his beautiful wife of 12 years and 2 children that are his biggest blessings. He is the recipient of the Purple Heart, 2 Army Commendation Medals, 2 Army Achievement Medals, the Good Conduct Medal, National Defense Service Medal, Operation Iraqi Freedom Campaign Medal with Star, Global War on Terror Service Medal, Valorous Unit Award, and the Combat Infantry Badge.
Thank you, Bree. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Donna and Kurt and Prudential and Weber Concrete, Holiday Inn Express, the Vet Freedom Center. I had a blast there this morning with the guys, talking with them. It's always amazing to get to come to new communities and see how everything works, especially from the veteran side, but also to see so many people who are non-veterans wanting to learn more about it. It's a fantastic thing. So the presentation I have is really just going to kind of take you through my experience. And like any situation, there's a start, there's a middle, and there's an end. And I'll try to get through it quickly for you. So in 2004, I enlisted in the U.S. Army as an infantryman. I went down to Fort Benning, Georgia, where I went through my basic training, AIT, and then I went on to a school called Javelin School, and then Airborne School, and then I went home for a break, and then flew back down there to report into my new duty station, which was in Fort Richardson, Alaska. So where the fun starts is on my plane ride to Fort Richardson. I was in a flight from Atlanta, Georgia, all the way to Anchorage. It was an 8-hour flight, and because I was flying on the government dime, I was in the back of the plane, and there were 3 rows of 3, and I happened to be in the middle row in the middle aisle. So I was sitting there, and I'm like, oh man, I'm going to be squeezed for 8 hours. And as I was looking down the aisle, seeing who was coming onto the plane, I noticed this beautiful woman with brown curly hair and this pinstripe suit carrying a brown Bath & Body Works bag. And I was like, oh, please sit next to me. Please sit next to me. That's who I want to sit next to me. And then I realized I was staring, so it made it a little weird, right? Like, I'm like, oh God, I got to put my head down. And so I stopped staring, and I put my head down, and a few seconds later, sure enough, the Bath & Body Works bag sat down in the seat right next to me on my right-hand side. And I'm like, in my head, I'm like, just play cool, don't look too desperate, right? You know, you got 8 hours to work this. So she gets herself situated, and it took me, as soon as she sat down in the chair, all of like 3 seconds to be like, hi, my name's Eric, how you doing? You know, the Joey, how you doing? And she looks at me, and she's like, oh, I'm Jen, and you know, the next thing we know, we often refer to that as our first date. That was my wife. I knew the minute I met her or saw her on the plane that was it. And so we had our first date. We had a chicken meal. They forgot the chicken in my meal. And we watched the movie Hitch, which was like the perfect romantic comedy. And then we get to Alaska. She goes her way. I go check in and get in a bus with a bunch of other guys and drive off to base. And I got this number. And so I, had to do the 2-day rule, right? How many people know the 2-day rule? Like, you don't want to look too desperate, right? You just met like this amazing person. And on the backside, it ended up being like 3 days by the time things settled down for me at base. And so I called her up and I said, hey, do you want to go for a hike? And she's like, what took so long for you to call me? And I'm like, well, I didn't want to seem too desperate. So that was in June of 2005 that I met my wife. By March of 2006, we were married. And from March, after we got married, to October of 2006 was just a crazy time. It was a really high tempo of training for my battalion. We were getting ready to go to war in October, and we had a whole bunch of events. I went to Thailand, I was up north of Alaska in the Arctic Circle training. I had been all over. In the process of this, we were blessed to find out that we were pregnant. And you know what, let me change this, I'm sorry, I forgot the clicker. But I thought if you guys get bored, you can look at these amazing pictures that I take. So all of these have some moments that have been meaningful on my journey. I should have explained that. But so my wife and I were pregnant. I'm getting ready to leave to go to war. It's October. I'm leaving. I get on a plane. I leave. I fly all the way over to Kuwait. And then from Kuwait, you got to go to Camp Buehring, which is also in Kuwait. And you do a little bit of training there before you go into Iraq. And as soon as I arrived at Camp Buehring, I had a Red Cross message waiting for me. My wife and I had lost our son David at 7 months. And so I immediately had to get back on a flight, fly home so I could be there for the stillbirth, and then bury our son at Fort Richardson National Cemetery. Less than about a week later, I was back on a flight going to Iraq. And once I arrived in country, my first night in country, I went out on a mission and I got blown up by my first IED. So in a course of a very short period of time, maybe 3 weeks, death was all around me. You know, you couldn't avoid it. And that IED experience like smacked me in the face and was like, hey, this is real. People are really going to try to kill you here. And there's a good chance you're probably going to die. So how do you deal with that fear when you know you have something that, you know, you have to deal with it? So the way I dealt with it was probably not the healthiest way. I just accepted the fact that I was going to die. I made jokes about it. Every morning I'd wake up and I'd be like, well, today's the last day. Get ready, boys. We're going to die today. And people would be like, shut up. Don't say that. Don't say that. But it was my way of coping with the fact that if it came, I would be all right with it. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but when you work in small groups, I was in a scout sniper platoon, and so we worked in small groups. Everybody has an important role to play. And if you can't do your job when you're under fire, you may cause your buddy to lose his life. And I didn't want to be that guy. So this was an easier way for me to deal with it. So throughout my journey in Iraq, you know, we lost friends, we got into firefights. February 14th came around, Valentine's Day, I called my wife, I'm like, hey, happy Valentine's Day. Went out for a mission, got blown up again on Valentine's Day, got lots of love. And that was an even worse explosion than the first one. After that explosion, I had trouble processing, I had trouble talking, I had migraines. That one really rocked my world. And so, you know, I did the best that I could, took a lot of Motrin. Anybody who's been in the military knows that you solve every problem with Motrin, unless you're at war, because then sometimes they'll give you the good stuff too. But for the most part, it was Motrin, and that was it. That was how I had to deal with the migraines that I had. That was how I had to deal with the situation, short of saying, I need to go for medical reasons, and I didn't want to be that guy leaving my unit. So I stayed there, came home for R&R, and my wife goes, you're having trouble putting sentences together. Are you all right? And of course, I'm like, my grandpa used to say, I'm finer than frog hair. I'm good. But that was when the unraveling started for me, because I wasn't able to have the filter that most people have. When you have a brain injury, you know, your frontal lobe, it causes, that's what filters what you say out, right? So like if I saw something, I was like, well, that's just, and it would just come out. I'm like, why did I just say that? And I started not being able to process the things in front of me. And so I ended up back in country. More time passed. I started to see, less migraines, less headaches. And on October 22nd, roughly about 3 weeks before I came home, I got hit with my third one, which is an EFP. So it's an explosively formed penetrator. Imagine a big sewer plate that covers the road, and you pack a whole bunch of explosives behind it, and when the bomb goes off, that sewer plate becomes one big slug that's meant to go through 10 inches of armor, so through a tank. Luckily, I was arguing with my lieutenant. I was driving. My lieutenant was in the front. My buddy, a good buddy of mine, was in the turret, and we were arguing like I always did. And my buddy leans down to join the argument to have my back with the LT. And as soon as he leans down, the turret of the Humvee gets hit with this EFP, which basically takes our Humvee and almost tips us back over. And had he been sitting upright, he wouldn't be here today. So for life for me, and I tell that specific story because it leads into life for me was measured in inches. Whether I lived or died, it was measured in inches. Half an inch and this bullet that just hit above my head and I wouldn't be here today. A quarter of an inch further where the armor was a little bit weaker in the Humvee, I wouldn't be here today. And so for a long time, I couldn't figure out why I was here. And I went home. And upon arriving home in November of 2007, I was immediately what they call medically flagged. I went through a post-health assessment, and for traumatic brain injury, I scored off the charts. For post-traumatic stress, I scored off the charts. And I was immediately medically flagged, and then the paperwork started for me to go to what's called the Warriors Transition Unit, basically a wounded warrior program within the Army. And I was not happy about that. I was good at my job. For the first time in life, I had a job that allowed me to push myself in ways I never thought were possible. If there was a barrier in front of me, it didn't matter. I just looked at it as a fun challenge and I would tackle it. And now all of a sudden you're taking this away from me. You're ripping it away, and I don't even have a choice in it. And so I was upset and bitter. And in February of 2009, I was medically retired, which means that I get a little blue Army card and I get some benefits and I get a little bit of money each month, which is great. But it doesn't take away from that larger picture of that I was actually happy doing what I was doing. I thought I was serving a purpose larger than myself. It was important. So I get out of the military, and life starts processing. My wife and I had another miscarriage, and then in that miscarriage, and this is literally, the timeline is just one right after another, we find a lump in her breast, and it turns out to be what's called a Phyllodes tumor, which is an incredibly rare form of cancer that's a carcinoma. So when we figured out what it was, we went to the doctors, and we lived in Alaska, and they're like, you got to go out of state for this. Nobody's ever seen this before. Nobody's ever handled it. And so we ended up being in Cedars-Sinai in California for her treatment. And when we arrived down there, one of the things the doctors told us right off the bat was, if this metastasized, you have a 2% chance of survival. And because of the way that the doctor in Alaska did the needle core biopsy, he had infected her whole chest tissue, her breast, everything needed to go. And so it was this major operation, it was this loss for her, and I found purpose, right? So I kind of put my stuff aside, and I was like, I need to be a rock for my wife. And if you ask me, I did a fantastic job. If you ask her, but in my head, that's what I needed to do. So I dove into that head on, and I leaned in in and did what I thought was the best in supporting her through those challenges. And as we went through, she went through treatment, and then it became 1 year, and we're through. And we got into the start of the second year, and we realized that we had kind of put our lives on hold because of this. And so my wife was offered a job in DC, a big promotion, and I said, sure, let's go. And it wasn't until I arrived in Washington, DC, that I actually started to unravel. Little by little, I didn't want to admit it at the time, but all the things that I had pushed to the side to lean into my wife were starting to creep up in my everyday life. The fear of not being secure, the fear of life. I no longer rolled out of the wire with 6 guys that would give their life for me in a heartbeat, and yet I saw threat everywhere. And that's what happens. You know, when you go to war, you see the worst in humanity, but you also see the best. The problem is what I was focused on was the worst. And so everywhere I looked, I always saw a threat. And if any of you have ever been to DC, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's all over the place. Like, there are neighborhoods you don't even want to go in. And so I found myself always, you know, stressing out about security, stressing out about all of this. And I started to unravel, and I was no longer that good, supportive husband that my wife was hoping. And so we got pregnant again. And this time, I had a feeling, I don't know specifically why, but I knew it would take. And so we have our child, she's pregnant, we have this is the 3rd pregnancy, and sure enough, everything went very smoothly, and we had a baby daughter. And in the process of all of this, it was also in the 2008 home crisis, so our house in Alaska hadn't sold. We were paying enormous rent in DC, and we had to make a decision. And because of the way that I was and the way that the financial situation was, we moved back to Alaska, and my wife gave up this promotion. Well, in the process of all of that, I realized that I needed some help. So I started working out again, I started feeling good again, and I leaned into my daughter, and I was like, I'm gonna be the best father I can be. And I was good for about a year. I was really happy with what I was doing. I was having fun. We were hanging out outside. But I was back in my little mountain house. I have to preface, I was in a house in the mountains away from everybody. So I wasn't in a city. I wasn't dealing with people. I didn't have to deal with fears or boxes or what was going to happen. I was just in my own bubble, and I was loving it. About a year later, we had another miscarriage. And Kaylee, my daughter, was getting older, and there's no sidewalks, there's no other kids around. We were in a remote part of Alaska. So my wife wants to move to the subdivisions, and in an effort to support her, I say yes, and I give up my dream house. That was the first thing that started to fall. Then we move into the new house, and it didn't turn out so great, and my dog bit my daughter in the face. At the same time, we welcomed a son into our house, so I had to give up my dog that had been with me since I came home from Iraq, that I raised from a pup. And then the car wasn't working anymore, which was my dream car, and because it didn't fit the both kids in the way, so I had to give up that, and I sold that and got a more family-friendly car. And then from there, my wife gets notice that we're moving to Indiana. Now, I was born and raised in Indiana. I got nothing against Indiana, but I spent my entire adult life trying to get out of Indiana, right? So this idea that I got to go back home to Indiana was like, what? And then we get to Indiana, and we stretch to be in a neighborhood with good schools, and we end up buying a house that the owners lied about all the stuff that was wrong in the house, including a huge mouse infestation, which we learned about within 24 hours of moving our stuff into the house. And in the process of all of that, I just gave up. I stopped getting up. I stopped caring. I actually became a shell of the person I was. And I opened up my wife, I had gotten the iPad and I opened it up, and my wife had been researching divorce attorneys. And that's when it's real. You know, you're not talking about it, you're not threatening, this is what's going on, this is what's happening. And I hit my low. I didn't really have that relationship I had hoped to have with my kids. My wife wanted a divorce. We had been through a lot in total. We've had 9 pregnancies and we have 2 kids. So we had endured a whole lot, not just war, but just a whole lot in the beginning of our marriage. And so at that moment, I was at probably the lowest point in my life. I grabbed my Glock out of its safe, went downstairs, sat in the kitchen, put a round in the chamber, put it in my mouth, and the only thing that kept me from pulling the trigger was, well, shoot, if I do that here, how are they going to live in this house or sell it? So then it became, well, where can I do this where it won't affect them, but I can say my piece? And as I'm trying to figure it out, I noticed that it was time to go pick my kids up from school. So I put my gun back away, went and picked up the kids. I was in school myself at the time at the Art Institute. Next day I went to school for class, came home. My phone was blowing up. It was finals, and so I had some big tests the next day. I didn't even look at them the next morning. I got up. It was 4:30 in the morning. My platoon sergeant, my first platoon sergeant I ever had, killed himself. This is the guy that was at my wedding. I still use his towels today. He was the reason I got home in time for my son David's stillbirth. He was a very important part of my life, and I'm not going to lie, we drifted apart after we both got out of the military. But what I realized in that moment was what other people feel when you take your own life. And so I was watching Rocky VI that night. I couldn't sleep. And there's a moment in there where Rocky's talking to his son, and he's like, it isn't how hard, life isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep getting back up. And I realized in that moment that I got hit so many times, I just stopped getting back up. I was like, I'm done. So that night, I chose life. I chose to not kill myself. And I knew that I needed help. And so I reached out to a program called No Barriers Warriors. No Barriers Warriors is a program that was created by Eric Weimer, the only blind man to ever climb Mount Everest, and his guide, Jeff Evans. And the idea about it is that you utilize the principles of climbing mountains to identify ways to move past the issues that you're having in your life. And I had always been climbing since I was 18 years old, so for me, this program was a good fit. Something I enjoyed doing, and I can relate to the terminology and what they're talking about. And Eric was a personal hero, so I was kind of like, maybe I'll get to meet Eric. In the process of all of that, I was on my first expedition. I had 3 expeditions that I did with them. And out on my first expedition, I got to hang out with like a real life photographer. Not just like the guy who takes pictures, nothing against that, but at a studio of people, I mean a real life adventure photographer who is shot on Everest, climbed Everest, done huge mountains, been really all over the world shooting and doing amazing work. And so I had him captive for like 8 days, and I was peppering questions at him left or right. And that's what you all have to do for young kids out here. When you find somebody that is in that line of sight of what you guys want to do, have a mentor you, pepper them, ask them questions while you have them in front of them, because that's what's going to drive you to the next level. I promise you that. And so in the process, we were on our last day, and I said to him, what do you do for security? He's gone to places where there's still cannibals, like they eat each other, and shot pictures of it. I'm like, I forget what the place is called right now. That's my TBI moment. But literally, they eat people over, each other. And I was like, what do you do for security? And he said, well, he goes through this long list about hiring fixers and local police, and it was kind of just like blah, blah, blah. And then he got to a point where he said, and in the end, Eric, you just have to have faith in humanity. You have to have faith in the human spirit. And then in a very Diedrich fashion, he runs off up ahead to take some photos of the other guys on the trip. And I'm left with 4 miles to walk out of this wilderness. Nobody's around me, and it's like a huge light bulb that goes off. I don't have any faith in humanity. I don't have it. I don't have faith in the human spirit. It was gone. It was non-existent. I had spent so much time around death and different things and seen the worst that people do to one another in the name of religion. And I just lost my faith. And it was in that moment that I realized that one of the problems that I was having with my wife is that she has a really strong faith in her and Christian faith in the way that she was brought up. And she wanted to bring that into our family and wanted to teach that faith to our kids. But how are you going to teach that when your husband has none? Doesn't even care. And so it was in that moment that I realized that, maybe there's something here. And that led me to this concept of moral injury. Moral injury is basically when in a long story short, I could give you an easy example. It's when you're forced to kill somebody or take somebody else's life, and now you have to deal with those repercussions. Somewhere down the line, that's going to creep into your thinking. Or another example, you're overseas and you're witnessing a father just beat the living daylights out of their kid. And you want to step in and rescue that kid, but you can't because you're not allowed to. You saw something that was against the moral fabric of who you are. And so what you do is you compartmentalize that and you put it away. You put it in a jar, or however you want to describe it, you put a lid on it, because there's nothing you could do, but that tears away at this moral fiber that we have. It makes you realize that everybody can have evil in them. So the problem for me was I always looked at the world that way, right? Like I always looked at it as everybody has this evil inside of them. What I forgot to look at was the other side. See, war also highlights the best in humanity. It can highlight the good that we're trying to do. And there are an amazing amount of good people who opened their homes to me, kept me and my friends, the 3 other guys I was with, safe, killed their last chicken and fed us. See, I was so fixated on the bad stuff that I never saw the good stuff. And that was what was driving, this inability to have faith, this inability to look forward. So I knew I needed to find my faith. We were going to recap this experience. I knew that I needed to rethink how I was living my life. And most importantly, I knew I needed to do something with my life. I needed to find purpose. So No Barriers Warriors asked you to make a pledge at the end of your expedition. And for us, it had to be a pretty decent pledge because we had 3 of them. And so I made the pledge that I was going to get my photography in a show. And that would do a few things. That would make me get out and force myself to talk to people in my community and to ask something of others, right? Because veterans, especially myself, I don't ask anybody for anything. I don't ask for help for anything. And that's not a good way to live your life. That doesn't build community around you. And so this was forcing me out of my comfort zone. It was pushing me in directions that I was not sure I was ready for, but I wanted to complete that pledge. I wanted to take seriously the program. The next thing that I had to figure out was, how do I find faith? That one's a little bit harder, right? And so it was my wife who helped me along that path. I would like to say that it's been a whole lot of people, but she sent me a card today. And in the card, it basically said, let God use his words through you, right? And I'm not here to evangelize at all, but that's the kind of love that she shows me every day and helps me on this path to realize that, the purpose of why I'm still here, the purpose of why it was a half an inch lower or half an inch right, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's this. Maybe it's sharing my story with this audience. Or maybe it's just the fact that I'm meant to raise 2 really good kids who might change the world. I don't know. But each of these paths have come for a reason. And so I knew I needed to find that, and I knew I needed to work on purpose. So in the beginning, my photography became my purpose. Within the third person that I asked, gallery owner, I was invited into a show a month later. And November, on Veterans Day of 2016, I had my first photography show, which then snowballed into a whole bunch of different things, like selling all my photography to Prudential Retirement and outfitting the entire 20th floor of the Hartford office, something I never thought I would do, to pushing myself beyond comfort zones and fears and changing the way I looked at the world. So veterans that are out here will know one of the things as a veteran, when you go into a restaurant, you will never sit your back to the restaurant. You'll never do it. At least I never did it, because I wanted to see the whole restaurant. I wanted to know what was going on so that if a threat walked into that restaurant, I would be able to take care of my family and the situation, or at least that's the way I believe it, right? So then I would sit down with my family at the dinner table, and my wife would be talking to me, my kids would be talking to me, and all I'm doing is this. Like, what's going on out there? All right, if somebody comes in and they do this, I'm going to do this, and I'm not even hearing them. So I'm not really living or enjoying that dinner or even making my kids feel special. So one of the things I did after this first expedition was I immediately started doing everything that I would normally do backwards. So I sat down, it was Father's Day, the day that I got back, we went out to breakfast, I sat down and I put my back to the room. And in the process of all of this, I was doing these things on purpose. I didn't necessarily know the why, right? I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a doctor, but I knew that I needed to do the opposite of what I was doing because what I was doing wasn't leading me into a right place. And through the process of all of this, I did meet doctors, and I did hear doctors speak, and there's one doctor, his name is Dr. Tharp, and I got to see him speak, and he's a colonel in the Air Force, and he's changing the script on how people look at PTS, because military veterans are getting treated for PTS in the same way that women get treated for PTS when they're raped. Well, they're 2 totally different things. They're going to affect people 2 totally different ways. How is that even relevant? How do you even do that? And so he's sitting here and he's talking about this, and he goes, so how many people, he goes, raise your hands, and he describes the scene that I just did at a restaurant. How many people in here do that? Everybody raises their hands. And he goes, how many people think that that's normal behavior? And a number of people were like, no, it's not. No, that's not. My wife tells me all the time it's not, cracking jokes about it a little bit. And at the end of it, he's like, well, I would argue that it's incredibly normal behavior if you were in Iraq or Afghanistan. You would want to do those things. So the reality is, what you need to realize is that, and understand, is that when you're here, you don't need to do those things because you have a better chance of winning the lottery than you do being in a terrorist incident or an active shooter situation. And there was a number of us who didn't believe that scenario, and then he broke it down mathematically, which I'm not that smart, and he actually proved us wrong. And it was in that moment that I realized we spend our days with everybody loading on all these fears of what could happen. We don't realize that that's not necessarily something we need to worry about every day. And so when I heard that, it was like another light bulb went off, and I started pursuing that and thinking about that, and I kept changing the behavior. Ultimately, my series with No Barriers ended with the climbing of Mount Snuffles. It was a 14,000-foot mountain in Colorado. And when I summited that mountain, I decided that that was it. You can't change the past. You literally can't change it. And while there's a number of things I would love to change, I can't. So I gotta let it go. But how do you let things go unless you're able to find faith? Faith that there was a purpose on why your buddy isn't here and you are. Faith that all of those miscarriages were meant to make us stronger as a couple to deal and wrestle with all of these issues that we are. Faith that, there's something better than the shell of existence that I was living. And I came down off of that mountain, and I wasn't sure what was next, wasn't sure where I was going. And I got a phone call out of the blue from the director of the program asking me if I will do some work on their behalf and talk to people, and I said sure. So literally one day I show up at an event, and he hands me a microphone with no preparation, no idea, and he says, share your story. And as I shared my story with that audience, I realized that I was like, wow, I actually kind of feel this weight coming off my shoulders. And I didn't get a chance to talk to anyone, and truthfully, I'm not even sure I did a great job. But that led to another event where I did speak in front of a big group of people. And I'm not sure what impact I made on them, truthfully. But I do know that there was one person in the audience who was struggling, and that individual was married to a guy not very different than me. And hearing the story about my wife's and our journey gave her hope that they might be able to figure out their situation. In the process of that, the VFW magazine came out. And her husband read the article that was written about me. And she gets done with the conference, and he's done with the article, and she calls him on her way to the airport, says, I can't wait to tell you about a speaker I heard today. He gives me hope. And he said, I can't wait to tell you about an article that I read. And she gets home, and she sees the cover, and it's me. And in that process, I only know that story because that individual sought me out months later to tell me what an impact that me sharing that story made in their life. I don't tell you that to be braggadocious, right? It's what makes this okay for me. Standing up, talking about the rawest moments of my life is that the hope is that there's one person that I reach in the audience that it makes a difference in their life. And so that's what continued to keep doing that. And I always encourage all the veterans I meet to share their stories, because that's the kind of thing that connects communities. That's the kind of thing that helps people understand what it means to go to war. Like, we live in a country where we send people off to war, but we're not really suffering here. While guys and gals are fighting overseas right now, we're living a pretty comfortable life. We don't have to sacrifice anything. And so in sharing those stories helps to bring together the civilians and the veterans. It helps civilians understand what war really is and why it's so important as you grow, especially all of you down here, understanding what your organization is about. That's why it's so important that you hear stories like this, because it allows you to have some idea and way to show compassion to others. And so ultimately, in the end, I've been on a series of speaking events where I talk about this, but this past January, I was tested, right? So, I've had lots of backfalls. I'm not, oh, wow, I don't have PTSD anymore. It doesn't work like that. So this past January, I was out in Christmas, I was in Alaska. My in-laws are there. And I have a buddy that's like the brother I wish not that I wish I had, but he was a brother to me. He was my very best close friend. And I'll put it this way, I call him up on Christmas Day, it's like 4 o'clock, and I said, hey Brent, Jen doesn't want to come with me. I want to try to go shoot the Northern Lights. I got to drive to Talkeetna because that's the only place that's, doesn't have clouds, that's clearing. This is the best night for it. I know it's Christmas, I'm sorry. You want to come with me? And the reason I asked is because it's a 3.5 hour drive in the dead of winter where the roads are ice. There's no lights, right? Like there's nothing, it's remote Alaska driving. And so he yells over to his wife, Amy, and he says, hey, can I go with Eric? Take him. That's what she yells to him, take him. And so I swung over there and I picked him up. And he was the kind of friend that we talked about faith. We talked about, wrestling with this idea of moral injury. We were a sounding board, but more importantly, we just never judged and we helped each other move forward. And so he went up there with me. We had some amazing conversations. Unfortunately, we did not see the Northern Lights. He got a little snookered along the way because in Alaska, like the passenger can drink as long as the driver isn't drinking. I know it's a little backwards, but it really is that way. So he got a little snookered while we were driving up there and passed out on the way home, which I was like, man, that's why I really needed somebody to moose watch. Because I saw 25 moose on the way back, and you hit a moose and you're done. And then 2 days later, he and I go and climbed a mountain called Flat Top. And Flat Top's a relatively easy mountain to climb. In the summertime, you can jog up it. A lot of people do. The wintertime, it gets a little bit trickier. This particular climb, there was no snow. It was all ice. So it was ice crampons and we didn't, an ice axe, I guess. We had to use it in one spot. But we got up there, watched this amazing sunset, had some really amazing conversation. And it was dark. We came down. Next day, we stopped by his house. I picked up an Nalgene bottle I forgot in the car. He gives my kids a handwritten card kind of thing. And we left to go to the airport. 3 weeks later, I'm about to leave to go talk to a large group of people. I was to leave in 4 hours, and I got a phone call that he had taken his own life. It wasn't something that any of us saw coming. There was no inclination. Looking back on it now, those cards that he gave to my kids, they said for your birthday, Easter, and it went through this long list. And I just thought it was him being him because he was always a little crazy. But looking back on it, he was already at peace with that. I often think back on that time and I find myself, instead of being upset at the fact that he died and that he didn't call and he didn't ask for help, I think back about standing on that mountain watching the most amazing sunset with my best friend. But that didn't make it any easier, right? So I knew I needed to lean into something. I knew I needed something to pull me through this. Otherwise, I was going to go back into that shell existence that I was before. And so I had been hired to photograph an expedition in Nepal. Jeff Evans was leading an expedition, and he had 2 teams, and I was going to be the Bravo team photographer. Now, why that's important is that's been my dream since I was 19 years old. I said randomly one day, sitting with a bunch of my friends in college, I'm going to go shoot people climbing mountains in Nepal. And for many, many years, I did nothing about it. At 39 years old, 20 years later, I was hired for my first job shooting people climbing in the mountains. There were celebrities that were coming on this trip. There were veterans that I helped get sponsorship to come on this trip. And then there were just climbers, guys who love to get out in the mountains and climb. And part of this expedition was to do humanitarian work at a place called the Center for Disabled Children's Assistance. And being the photographer, I knew, all right, this is my job. I'm going to lean into this and I'm going to figure this out. And that's going to help me get through Brent. So I called the founder of this organization because I know they're going to be wanting some shots with some disabled kids, and I don't ever want to exploit disabled kids, and no one else wanted to either on the team. I don't want it to sound like that. But in trying to prepare for the trip, knowing what I was allowed to photograph and what I wasn't, I reached out to the founder, and we were talking on Facebook, typing messages back and forth. And I asked him what his greatest need is. I'm like, I got a bunch of kids' clothes at home. Like, what can I bring to help these kids out? And he simply says, I don't need any of that. I need wheelchairs. Can you bring me wheelchairs? I said, well, how many wheelchairs do you need? And he said, 8. And 3 of them are for children with cerebral palsy. And I'm reading this, and I simply write to him, I'll have to get back to you on that. Because when I make a promise, I always try to deliver on that promise no matter what. So I didn't want to promise, but I thought about it and wanted to think about it because truthfully I know nothing about wheelchairs. I thought you could just go online and like buy a wheelchair and be like, here you go. There's like a whole fitting to it. You got to measure people like wheels. There's a science to it, especially with cerebral palsy. So as my wife's telling me I'm crazy, and she's like, don't do this. And then there was just like this little rebellion streak in me. It was like, what? Don't do this. You're the one who tells me I'm supposed to have faith all the time. Shouldn't I have faith that, this was brought to me because I'm supposed to be doing it? And then she looked at me and she couldn't say anything back. So I went upstairs and I emailed him back and I said, I'll bring you your 8 wheelchairs. And from that point, I was like, okay, now what am I going to do? Like, I don't know anything about wheelchairs. So the first thing I knew is raising money. I've been working with No Barriers, raising money for a year. So I'm like, I know how to raise money. I'll raise money. That's the biggest problem for starters. And so I call my friend Eric Weimer, and I say, hey, would you be willing to donate a book? This is what I'm doing. This is why I'm doing it. And he's like, I'll donate my whole suite. Just let me know what you need of books and DVDs and all that sort of stuff. And he said, by the way, I know a guy in the wheelchair business. Do you want me to make a connection for you? I'm like, oh God, yes, please. Please. I have no idea what I'm doing. It's a total you-know-what show. And so I get introduced to a guy by the name of Wayne Hansen. Wayne Hansen started a Christian-based nonprofit called Reach Out and Care Wheelchairs. His story in itself is remarkably inspirational, and how that all came, but I won't go into that. He thought I was a little crazy when I told him what I was going to do, but he said, by all means, instead of trying to do this through, somewhere else, why don't you run the fundraiser through us? And whatever money you raise will go to these wheelchairs and we'll get them over to the kids. So in 10 days, I raised $9,450. I was able to get all 8 wheelchairs. The shipping of it was ridiculous. We almost went bankrupt on getting on actually getting the wheelchairs there. And I went over there, and a few other veterans and I built these wheelchairs, and we had a fitter fly in from Kuwait. And on every level, I was just overcoming fears. In order to get to Nepal, I had to fly through the Middle East. I never wanted to go back to the Middle East, but here I am. And for the first time, I wasn't fearful of it. I was looking it around, and I was trying to take it all in a different way. I get to Nepal, and Nepal reminds me of Iraq. There's still raw sewage that runs out into the street and comes down, and it's these smells that are all coming back. And my buddy Denny, who's a Marine vet, and we stayed at the center. Everybody else went back to the hotel, and the center was like 30 minutes away from our hotel, and we had to navigate all the way back. And so it was these two vets talking about, man, this looks a lot like Iraq. And it was just these eerie coincidences, but we were overcoming these fears. And in the process of that, we also got to change lives. I thought that the kids' faces would be the thing that matters. And for all the parents in here, I was wrong. It was looking into the parents' eyes. I have a shot of a mother and a daughter, and the daughter was 8 years old, and the mother had been carrying her on her back her entire life because she had cerebral palsy and had nowhere to put her down at. There was nowhere clean, and so the only time she could put her down was when she was in their home and she could lay her in a bed. So otherwise, the child was strapped to her back, and the sense of relief and the sense of sure gratefulness of looking at her, realizing that she finally, for the first time in her child's life, has a safe place to put her. And I'm seeing this all through my lens finder, right? Which is the way that I like to see the world. And it's unfolding in front of me in a way that I could have never thought. And so I was really moved, and we made the delivery, and the next day we were flying into the Himalayas, and I was going to be doing my dream, shooting people, climbing a mountain. I'm like, yes, this is amazing. That night I came down with salmonella, but not just any kind of salmonella, an antibiotic-resistant form of salmonella, which led me to having a fever of about 104 degrees, and I had to navigate after 3 days in Nepal and not getting any better, I had to navigate 32 hours home, to where my wife would be picking me up and then drive 2 hours home to the hospital in our hometown. And again, I had to travel through the Middle East, and it was all of these fears, and it was a challenge. It forced me out of all comfort zones. But when I finally got into the hospital, and after a couple of days of pain meds and some other stuff, I finally realized what I had accomplished in my life. And my new friend Wayne from Rock Wheels was biting at was chomping at the bit to get me on the phone to talk about my experience, because I had been posting on Facebook. And the first thing he said to me is, do you think that we have a veterans program here? And I said, yeah, I think so. And so he and I have been working back and forth, and we've created a program that's meant for veterans to have that same experience and overcome those same fears. It's point of where I go is, and where I'm going with this is, we never know where purpose is going to take us, right? Sometimes we want to plan everything out in life, and the one thing that I've learned in the last 3 years is when you're open to changes, when everything doesn't have to fit into a box, because that's the way it works for you. When you're open to the idea of looking at the positive first rather than looking at the negative, you find that purpose, and it drives to where we go without even trying. And in the process, you find joy and happiness and laughter and love, which are all things that I was missing for about 7 years of my life. And all of that stems from coming back to finding my faith and being able to believe in something more, that things have purpose. And that's where we are today.
Well, thanks a lot, Eric, for coming in and talking to us and sharing your story. It wouldn't be a quasi-military event without getting a coin, so I got to give you a Sergeant Jeff Dodge coin. On the backside has the symbol of our Veterans Center, and the University of Dubuque symbol. On the other side, it's got the Spartan helmet with the UD veteran patch and all the services, and it says "Duty, Honor, Country." Can't buy you a cup of coffee unless you're at the Veterans Center. I'll get you one there. But anywhere on campus, pretty much. Thanks a lot for what you do.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for having me.